Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to our workshop series. We're going to start the third of our four workshops. We're really excited to have you back and hope that you're enjoying the workshop and finding time between sessions to engage with some of the material and think about some of the learning that's happening within your own institutional organizational contexts. My name is Jeff Cohen. I'm Executive Director of Global Affairs at the University of Washington Tacoma, and I'll be facilitating today's session along with a couple of colleagues who I'll introduce you to in just a moment. Before we get started, we would like to invite you to acknowledge and reflect on the histories of dispossession and forced removal that have allowed for the growth and survival of the United States and our institutions of higher education. As people on occupied territories, we must acknowledge the land, the ancestors who have cared for this land since time immemorial, and all of our Native and Indigenous connections today. In light of these histories, we have a responsibility to take active efforts to partner with Native and Indigenous community members and neighbors to seek justice as we continue our work together as a community of learners, leaders, and educators. We hope you'll see throughout today's session the ways in which our two colleagues and the folks they work with try to live into this land acknowledgement and think about study abroad programming and mobility programming through the lens of indigeneity and social justice. As I mentioned, this is the third in our session, and this one is oriented around inclusive program design, with a specific focus on the idea that outreach and support for historically marginalized students must include study abroad program design aimed at meaningfully engaging students' social identities and histories. Our schedule for today, we're going to engage in a brief opening activity, asking you to reflect on some of the data that we hope you've been able to collect over the last few weeks from your own institution. We're then going to have interactive presentation, about 45 minutes, inclusive of 2 short presentations and some opportunity for conversation, discussion, question and answer. We'll take about a 10-minute break. Hopefully we'll get that full 10 minutes. That's our goal. So you can get up and move your bodies and get out of your chairs. And then we'll return and do some breakouts and small group exercise. We'll debrief and report out from those exercises. And then we have our normal closing and assignment of a task for you for the next session and some things to think about for our follow-up as well. So for our opening activity, we wanted to ask you to re-engage with some of the data that you have been hopefully been collecting and looking at in terms of your own institutional context or organizational context. And as you are thinking about and reflecting on the data that you've been collecting, in particular at the program level, what are some areas of strength that you feel you and your organization institution exemplify? Where are things going well in the kinds of programs you're creating and offering for students? And then also, what are some gaps in your study abroad program offerings? So what are some areas of growth that you may have identified? So we're going to put you in small groups for about just under 10 minutes to discuss this, and then we'll return back to the main room and maybe do a real brief report out to see how what's bubbling up for folks. So I think Cindy is going to handle creating some breakouts for us. Oh, there you go. Welcome back, everyone. Apologies for cutting off what I imagine were engaging conversations, but we will have opportunity a little later in today's session for a longer conversation amongst our peers. We have just a brief moment if anybody wanted to share something that grew out of their conversation or a new strength or gap that may have emerged in conversation with others.
So I'll start. So while many of us focused on our student population and maybe the majors, toward the end of our discussion, it came out and reminded us all the geographic diversity of where our programs are going and who's leading the programs, who's actually, the administrative and/or faculty leader taking our students and really considering that as a driver or reciprocal relationship in how we can diversify our study abroad.
Thank you for that, Marissa. Yeah, I think right, both of those connected to one another, right? It's both about sort of diversifying the geographic areas, but as you mentioned, also thinking about who's best suited to lead those programs in ways that they are generative and not sort of replicating issues around appropriation and complexities that have been discussed in some of the prior sessions. Thank you for that. But one more, and then we'll jump into the presentations. Oh, all right, we can move forward. That's okay. So our presentation today is going to be facilitated again by myself, but also by two wonderful colleagues who are going to talk about some really incredible work they're doing in different spaces. One is Du Bois Jennings, who's Director of Engagement in North America for Education New Zealand, and the other Nicholas Barr, who's Director of Study Abroad in the Department of Comparative History of Ideas at the University of Washington, Seattle. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues in just a moment, but we also want to help facilitate some conversation throughout this process. And so both Du Bois and Nick will give relatively brief presentations about some of their work. As you're listening to them, we would love for you to be making note of what you hear that might align with or respond to these three guiding inquiries. You can find them here. Cindy's going to put these in the chat as well, but they're also included in the handout for this week's session. So if you go to the shared drive where the materials are, one of the PDFs, it's also in Word format, has these in it. It's the in-session handout and small group exercise. And there's this space in there for you to take notes as you go. You're welcome during the presentations to make note of this in the chat as well, and we'll track that and use that for conversation at the end. But as you're listening, think about what experiences, knowledge, and understandings are being privileged and promoted in the programs that are being discussed by our colleagues. How are student participants being acknowledged, represented, and amplified? And what co-design, co-creation, and co-leadership models are you noticing being employed in the programming that they describe? So again, just make note of these and we'll guide you through a conversation and facilitate a conversation at the end here. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Du Bois Jennings, who's going to speak about some of the programming they're doing at Education New Zealand. Du Bois.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Kia ora koutou. Hello, everyone. My name is Du Bois Jennings. As Jeff mentioned, I'm Director of Engagement in North America for Education New Zealand. If you didn't know, Education New Zealand is a New Zealand government agency responsible for promoting New Zealand as an education destination. And I'll talk a little bit later about how that relates to inclusive program design. But I kind of wanted to begin this by just going back to those three guiding questions, because I'm going to offer some examples of programming and how we do things at Education New Zealand around creating international education programming that is inclusive and works to the values and goals of the communities and the target student populations that we're trying to work with. So, you know, what are the experiences, knowledge, and understandings are being privileged and promoted on programs? You know, when you're designing a program and you identify its location, what are the narratives and experiences being highlighted in that program? You know, how can your program include or even focus or put at the center traditionally silenced and historically marginalized populations in the region? And, you know, what are the students learning? What knowledge is being privileged and highlighted? And, you know, does it account for Indigenous or communal knowledge or knowledge that may fall out of the bounds of Western academia? And how are students, participants being acknowledged? Are their values and goals of the target student demographic represented in your program design? How is what they bring to the program being supported and amplified, you know, their strengths and their backgrounds? And then finally, and I am finding the most important piece and is really at the center of a lot of the work I'm doing right now is co-design, co-creation, and co-leadership models. And this, really relates to that second point of, working with the student. How are you engaging with partners on campus who have relationships with the target demographic of students, or other offices, departments, or even affinity groups and communities, student communities on campus, and working with them? Are you including them in program design and program creation? So I'll start with some examples of the first principle. These are examples related to the knowledge and experience and understandings that are the focus of a program. And I've kind of broken them into two categories. You'll see two programs up here. And the first, you have programs in quote unquote traditional study abroad locations where the focus of study is not on the majority population and its culture. It centers the culture and knowledge of historically marginalized people in the location. So for example, the Institute of Study Abroad Ireland has partnered with public and community colleges in Alabama to create a program that focuses on civil rights and social justice. Ireland's civil rights movement was influenced by the civil rights movement in the US, so there's connections there, and that's where the focus of that program is. And I just want to make a caveat or point something out about that program, and something we should remember as international educators. Students from marginalized backgrounds are not a monolith. So we can't think that all Black students want to learn about a civil rights program in their international education experience, or all Native American students want to go overseas to connect with other Indigenous communities. So how to gauge the target students' interests and needs comes down to what we talked about in the second and third point, co-design and co-creation, and really having that relationship with the target demographic. And then just moving on here, the program on the right here, it's a program offered by Syracuse Study Abroad called Paris Noir that focuses on the influence of Black culture, literature, and experiences in Paris. Students study contemporary literature, art, and the lives of African Americans, Africans, and Afro-Parisians. And then another program that I'm aware of, I'm sure there are plenty more, I just wanted to list a couple. AIFS summer program Black London explores London through the history of the African diaspora. And students read and explore communities with African, African-American, Caribbean, and Afro-British roots. Students also visit organizations tasked with tackling institutionalized racism. And then the other program category is quote unquote non-traditional locations, but changing the narrative and curriculum and the program focus. So what do our programs look like? If you think about study abroad programs on continents like Africa and South America, I tend to see a lot of these programs framed around service learning, and it's a unique culture to be observed. It's been my experience that STEM subjects like philosophy, art, STEM subjects and other subjects like philosophy or art history are not promoted in these countries. And courses like anthropology and sociology are usually, observed or approached in kind of a Western lens in these destinations. And the knowledge in these locations is, Western tinge, and subjects are oftentimes not seen as valuable or holding real academic merit if it's taught, from their cultural perspective. There are a couple of programs that I'm aware of that try to change that narrative. So the picture on this slide, there used to be a program called Art History in Ghana, but I think it's evolved now it's now Arts and Sciences in Ghana. And the program offers courses in art history, economics, biology, and political science, among others. And then another example I'm aware of is IFSA's study abroad program, Psychology and Neuroscience in Argentina. The program leverages it and promotes Argentina's rich and progressive history with mental health and the practice of psychology, and has a program that revolves around high-level psychology courses in its universities. Next slide, please. So this slide is a more in-depth look at a program that tries to shift the narrative of a location and makes the focus on the values and knowledge of its Indigenous population, in this case, Maori people of New Zealand. So Noho Marae is a course taught at Auckland University of Technology. And instead of just a course where students learn about Maori culture, they actually live it by taking part in traditional ceremonies and spending a significant amount of course time in Maori community meeting areas. And students must live Maori cultural values of guardianship and reciprocity to succeed in the class. And lineage and heritage are core principles of Maori culture. So the students must also reflect on their experiences, lineage, and where they come from to succeed in the class. So students become custodians of the culture and respectfully participate without culturally appropriating. And students apply Maori principles to their Maori principles and worldview to their own lives. So during this time, they're doing coursework that asks the students to reflect on their own identity and analyzing it through the lens of Maori culture, prioritizing and valuing the Maori approach to learning. And the reason this course has been so successful is because it's designed and led by Maori. And this relates to the other guiding principle that we talked about in the beginning, this idea of co-design and leadership. So next slide, please. So this slide, I can get into a little bit more of what, collaboration would look like in the creation of a program. Who are your office partners on campus or other groups that you're working with who have those relationships with historically marginalized students or the demographic you're targeting? And they should be, at the very least, collaborators, but ideally co-designers in the program creation. So this picture is an example of a program that was about to launch at the University of Maryland, but was put on pause due to COVID. The program was designed for University of Maryland's College Success Scholars, or the CSS office, which is a program that provides academic and personal support for a group of Black and Latino University of Maryland students. And the goal was to create a course with a mobility component into the curriculum. This course would eventually be open to the rest of campus and made a general education option. And the pilot program, for the pilot program, University of Maryland chose New Zealand as a destination. So the program would center historically marginalized and resilient voices, life experiences, and world issues. So rather than engage with New Zealand around its commonly promoted features like nature or their Western academic disciplines or surface level engagement with Maori culture, marginalized and Indigenous voices and their approach to leadership are centered in the experience and integral to the program design. So furthermore, the deficit narrative so prevalent in US higher education is non-existent. The program draws from the strengths and skills the target students have developed based on being part of a historically marginalized population in the US and seeks to enhance their development through an international experience. And this international experience presents them with another minoritized group on the other side of the world. So the two groups are not only able to learn from each other, but also approach learning through the lens of Indigenous traditions, values, and ways of learning of the Maori people. And because this program was a joint effort with the CSS Scholars Office and the International Office, co-design was baked into the program creation. The CSS Office helped drive the program curriculum and activities based on their intimate knowledge and even input from the students they serve. And that input piece is going to be really important in my perspective. So next slide, please. So finally, I wanted to end my portion of the presentation with a kind of high-level look at co-design and co-development with Indigenous and historically marginalized populations. So in the context of my work at Education New Zealand, co-design and collaboration is not done out of just a moral obligation or a nice to have. It's actually mandated in New Zealand law. So New Zealand's founding document, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi, dictates obligations for the New Zealand Crown government to protect Maori rights and sovereignty. So in an effort to right the wrongs of New Zealand's colonial history, the government is required to look after Maori interests. And the legacy and importance of this document goes beyond Maori language or using Maori words and values in our core principles or just having Maori names. New Zealand government agencies are required to consider and implement Maori interests, values, and goals into our work. So this will take the shape in 2021. We received a letter of expectations from our education minister, Chris Hipkins, on the ways in which Education New Zealand needs to uphold the Crown's obligations to the treaty. So some key points from the letter, and I'm quoting directly here, are to establish and regulate an education system that honors Te Tiriti o Waitangi and supports Maori Crown relationships, to present New Zealand's education system to the world in a way that acknowledges the importance of the treaty and the Maori worldview, to ensure international students are exposed to the Maori worldview, and to partner with iwi, iwi is the name of Maori tribes, Maori providers of education services to transform the understanding of international education and ensure that education system delivers with and for Maori in the international context. And that with is really critical here. So with the guidance of Education New Zealand's Kaitohu Matua Maori, or our Chief Advisor Maori, Carl Wixon, ENZ is incorporating these principles into our everyday work and are developing a framework of how we engage with Maori iwi, organizations, and educational providers. And I want to stress that this is in its very early stages, and we face immense challenges in actually implementing this framework, as it will take years to become operational. But it will fundamentally change how our organization approaches international education programming and partnership development. Because the goal outlined by the framework is to operationalize how we work with not just Maori providers like government entities and institutions, but the actual iwi tribes and communities. So this way, Maori values and goals are reflected in our work around the world, and the values and interests of their communities are reflected in the partnerships and initiatives that we create. So I say this will fundamentally change our work because values and outcomes will have to be looked at through a Maori lens. That will necessitate co-design and co-leadership of Maori in the work that we do. So, when we think about measuring outcomes, most of the work, in academia or even in government organizations, it's all statistics and numbers, but those aren't the values of Indigenous communities or of Maori people. So we have to rethink how we're evaluating the work that we do and what they consider value and goals for the achievements that we're looking at in terms of international education. So the approach the New Zealand government takes has me constantly thinking about what this could look like at institutions in the US. If campuses already, and what campuses already have approaches like this or are thinking about, engaging with their target population or their communities and what co-design looks like. And when designing international education projects to benefit student population, what steps are being taken to learn the needs of the communities these students are from? And are institutions widening the scope of what they consider knowledge and academia to account for, say, who don't have PhDs of academic knowledge? And also thinking about faculty-led programs or engaging with host cultures. What steps are being taken so there's a reciprocal partnership being established in the program design, so you're actually helping the communities achieve their goals in the host countries, and what input do they have in your program design? So I'm really excited to hear thoughts in the breakout sessions later and hear what you all are currently doing or ideas you have about this. But for now, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Barr, who will provide an in-depth look at a program at the University of Washington, Seattle that embodies these principles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Du Bois. That was fantastic. And I will do my best to try and draw some connections, because I think there is a lot of overlap in kind of how we approach the work that we do within my department, study abroad programs. But I've been learning so much, from that presentation and from the previous weeks about just how much more we can be doing too. So thank you. To briefly introduce myself, I'm Nick Barr, you see him pronouns, and I have a couple of different roles in my department. I'm both the director of study abroad within the department, as well as a part-time lecturer. So I wear sort of a few different hats, including leading a study abroad program, which I'll talk a little bit about. Just to tell you a little bit first about what Comparative History of Ideas is, or refer to it as CHID for short. It's an undergraduate major and minor at the University of Washington, Seattle. And it's an interdisciplinary humanities curriculum grounded in student-driven creative inquiry. So rather than having an established set of topics that we cover or areas of study, it's really grounded in student interest. Which translates in an important way into our study abroad programs. We offer a range of faculty-led study abroad programs throughout the year. Pre-COVID, we were running anywhere from 8 to 12 programs a year. That's scaled back, obviously. And we work together with the Central Study Abroad Office at the University of Washington. So these are just programs that run through our department, but obviously working through the Central Study Abroad Office at UW-Seattle. Next slide, please. So the way we think about program design in CHID is study abroad programs are a great way to connect concepts that students learn on campus with the world, with their own experience and with what they can experience in the world. So we think about study abroad programs as ways to explore intellectual problematics, which is another way of saying a set of complex questions, and that we can do this through experiential learning. So it's different from, for example, language acquisition programs, which are also obviously invaluable. And they're also different from general overviews of a country or a region. So some of the kinds of examples that Du Bois just talked about. Instead, each program is guided by specific themes and questions. We'll look at some examples in just a minute. Our programs explicitly center both individual and collective reflection. We ask students to think about their positionality, both relative to other student participants and to people that they encounter abroad. So again, some of the themes that came up in last week's session. And I'll share a few pedagogical resources that that have actually been developed through some of our study abroad programs at the end of my presentation. Next slide, please. So the first sample program I'd like to share is a program to Mexico City, which focuses on LGBTQIA+ communities and activism from a comparative perspective. This was one of the first explicitly LGBTQ-focused study abroad programs in the country. I'm sure that there are more by this point, which is fantastic. And the program explores parallels and differences between activism in the United States and Mexico. It also connects to larger issues of public health and migration. And this is led by two program directors of color. The first is Dr. Anu Taranath, who is faculty in CHID and the Department of English at UW-Seattle, and Sasha Duchaudhary, who is an alum who participated in some of Dr. Taranath's other study abroad programs, a current staff member, as well as a Master's of Social Work candidate who's finishing their degree this year. In 2017, with special funding from the UW-Seattle Office of Global Affairs, a previous iteration of the program facilitated visits to Seattle from program partners in Mexico prior to program departure. So this really helps scaffold program learning and community building, as well as promoting reciprocity. So not just having US students and faculty and staff travel abroad, but also having program partners visiting the US. So I think this really speaks to what Du Bois was just saying about values and outcomes, that we have to think not just about what is this doing for our programs and for our students, but also how does this also serve the needs and goals of the people that we partner with. And I think it's also worth highlighting that point of reciprocal travel, because one of the things that is quite striking sometimes for students is that while if you have a US passport, it's relatively easy to go to a lot of places in the world, the reverse is not true whatsoever. And we've unfortunately had cases where we tried to do something similar with a program partner who was not able to obtain a visa to visit the United States. So I think this also kind of shows how study abroad is of course embedded in these larger imbalances of power. And that's something we have to thematize in our work as well. Next slide, please. The second program I would like to highlight is called Tolerance, Identity, and Difference in Amsterdam. So this is a program that I co-lead. And hopefully this will dovetail nicely with what you learned from Flor last week about some of the issues that come up in the context of Dutch history and Dutch society today. So the program highlights the gap between touristic conceptions of Amsterdam as, quote, the most liberal city in the world, and this is from a recent popular book title, and the reality, which is much different. So this program is designed to bring ideas from the humanities, in this case, a critique of the discourse of tolerance, so sort of tolerance in scare quotes, and we bring these ideas to bear on the lived experiences of minoritized people in the Netherlands. So we cover a lot of what Flora described last week in the pre-departure orientation that her team provides. But we actually make this the core thematic of the program. So in a certain sense, it's akin to that Paris Noir program that Du Bois mentioned. On the very first day of the program, we take the students on the Black Heritage Amsterdam tour, which is led by Jennifer Tosh, who you can see on the slide on the right. And so this tour takes a classic tourist activity, a canal boat tour, and flips it to reveal how the historical legacies of Dutch involvement in the slave trade and colonialism are embedded in the built environment of the city. 100% of the guest speakers on the program are people of color. So this is also important because it undermines presumptions about who is authentically, in quotes, Dutch, and who is authorized to speak about Dutch culture and society, including contemporary controversies such as the figure of Zwarte Piet in the Sinterklaas holiday, which was mentioned last time. So this involves white Dutch people wearing blackface. And we show how there's a very active political movement to change this tradition called Kick Out Zwarte Piet. This is also a short program, which is designed for students with limited schedule availability. So it's typically about 10 to 13 days. In 2019, we collaborated with University of Washington Athletics to bring 18 student athletes for 10 days. This is also a good model, I think, for students who have work or family obligations, medical restrictions, and who can't leave the US for extended periods. This is something that I heard a little bit about in the breakout room that I visited earlier. Next slide, please. So some of the strengths that I think our programs embody, there's a very strong student investment in inquiry because there are genuine questions being asked. And this is really centrally integrated with CHID's curricular and pedagogical approaches on campus. So students see a really natural connection between what they're learning and how they're learning on campus and how they can develop this further through study abroad. It also appeals to non-humanities students who want to make the most out of their time as students. I hear from students all the time who are maybe taking very strict sequences of STEM courses, and they might have a period free when they really want to not just kind of take care of core humanities requirements, but also make use of study abroad. Another strength is that we are making explicit parallels to social justice issues that students care about at home. Some of these have been really powerful direct connections, for example, between Black students and Black guest speakers in the Netherlands, who are learning about histories and contemporary transnational movements against anti-Black racism, such as this movement to kick out Zwarte Piet. There are also parallel issues like Latinx students learning about Islamophobia that's directed against Moroccan Dutch and Turkish Dutch people, and how this touches on political debates over, for example, language and assimilation. These parallels help to facilitate direct outreach to historically marginalized students. Programs that explicitly take up social justice themes help communicate to historically marginalized students that study abroad is actually something for them, and that has not traditionally been part of study abroad recruitment messaging. I think Du Bois mentioned this caveat, which is really important too, that we shouldn't assume that all students who have a certain identity are only interested in a certain kind of topic. But I think this does, it is something that can be a really important way of shifting at least how study abroad has traditionally been framed and marketed. Finally, our pedagogical emphasis on self-reflection is key, I think, for deepening learning for all participants. So obviously this form of program design does not detract from, but rather enriches the learning of other students. Next slide, please. So this is not to say that we don't face ongoing challenges beyond inclusive program design. First of all, supporting historically marginalized students also means supporting historically marginalized faculty. What Professor Brackett and Vivi shared last week strikes me as really the gold standard and made me think a lot about what more I could do to improve my own program. By contrast, marginalized students might rightly worry not only about how people abroad and their fellow students will treat them, but honestly their own faculty. I, for example, heard previously from a Black Muslim student on another study abroad program about being singled out by her professor for with negative attention every time they discussed the issue of terrorism. Obviously, it's important to recruit more faculty of color to teach study abroad programs. And frankly, this is part of a much larger problem of the lack of faculty diversity in higher education as a whole. And I think from a study abroad perspective, institutions need to incentivize and reward study abroad teaching appropriately if they want to make study abroad programs more inclusive. Another issue is perceptions of safety that can make program recruitment inequitable. Unfortunately, the global inequities of the pandemic appear to be reproducing to some extent old patterns of study abroad participation, both in terms of who is studying abroad and where. And I think this is going to take sustained, deliberate effort to counteract. And finally, I probably don't need to say, but finances are a perennial challenge. One thing that UW Seattle has done, I'm not sure about UW Tacoma, is that the Study Abroad Office now offers scholarships solely on the basis of financial need without a separate scholarship application. And this has greatly reduced barriers to participation. Requiring additional scholarship materials is often a big ask for students who are already stretched very thin. Next slide, please. Just like to share a few additional resources that have emerged through our study abroad programs in CHID. Both of these are the work of my colleague, Dr. Anu Tarnoff. The first is a book that she recently published called Beyond Guilt Trips, Mindful Travel in an Unequal World. This has lots of approachable ideas for facilitating conversation about privilege and travel in a productive and inviting way. The second is called Tips to Study Abroad, Simple Letters for Complex Engagement. And this is a really neat pedagogical tool for self-reflection while students are abroad. It has a kind of epistolary or letter writing structure that allows students to step back, but also focus on particular elements of their experience and use those as the basis for reflection. So to explain the acronym, you can do this on a weekly basis or on some other sort of time frame, but basically you have each person write sets of letters that are addressed to specific entities. So you would write a letter to a thing. So for example, dear plastic water bottle, an idea, for example, privilege. P is for person, and there might be a guest speaker or a historical figure, and then a letter to yourself. And this is something that I've used and have recommended to all of our faculty program directors, and it, I think, has created some really wonderful reflections. Next slide, please. So that's all I had to share for my presentation. There's more information on our website, of course, and I'm happy to be in touch as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Du Bois. I'm going to stop my screen share so that we can engage in some conversation here, and all of the slide decks are available to you along with the links in the materials. So we are right on track. We have 10 minutes to have a conversation and reflect on the guiding inquiries, and I'll ask Cindy to put those back in the chat real quick for us if you've hopefully have those also in some other space. And we're really open to conversation if you want to reflect back on some of what you heard from Du Bois and or Nick, or if what they've been discussing and the inquiries sort of sparked some thinking around your own work and the spaces that you're working in now. This really is just an open opportunity to reflect. And I want to just real quick before we do that, you can use the raise hand function to start. But I do want to thank both Du Bois and Nick, not only for their presentations, but also for what I hope comes through and what I know about them is how passionate and dedicated and committed they are to really engaging this program design models through a participatory framework. And so thank you both for that work. So let's open it up for conversation and reflection, and then we'll take a break after that. Go ahead, Megan. Yeah. Oh,
So, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you're good. Is it Megan or Megan? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Yes, it's Megan. I may have misunderstood, or I thought we were maybe going in breakout rooms. No,
we're
no. Okay.
It's a larger group reflection on what we've heard so far. Yeah.
Sorry for the misunderstanding.
No, you're okay.
I could ask a question to get us started if nobody else wants to.
I mean, Marie go first, Nick.
Okay, great. Perfect.
Marie.
I am loving these ideas, and I love the idea of approaching everything in this kind of almost a paradigm shift of let's frame this in a different way. And even when we're setting something up, flip things on its head, and also making sure we're engaging with the communities. The one part that I struggle with is that it seems, and it's so frustrating, right? Because this is embedded in all the structures that we're trying to butt up against, is the resources issue of, so I'm from a small community college that already doesn't have a large investment in study abroad. And we work in a consortium model. So if anyone has any experience in ways to do this in kind of a scrappy, we don't have any money type of way, I would greatly appreciate any tips or ideas that you all have, or even maybe sending out into the universe. Maybe we could partner, or for places that tend to have a little bit more resources, could you purposely reach out to community colleges to partner? Because that's another source of diversity that tends to not have as much resources to extend to students and whatnot. So I guess food for thought / also appreciation, because this seems so great, but it's almost like I'm not sure where we could start with it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Nick, Du Bois, either of you have a reflection, or anyone else in the audience that might?
I actually would like to add to that. I think for institutions that are small, offices of 1 or 2 people and faculty, I'm not saying that our issues are less or more. We just have different, realities. And I think more collaborations and teaming up with different institutional types really broadens the organizational capacity. I as a basically single person global education office, all of this is aspirational in a sort of overwhelming way, because getting started has been a labor here of building those relationships and building those partnerships here, but expanding beyond that and really making things happen is going to require a lot more. And places like, Tacoma have it, or Washington have it. You just don't. And so I'm wondering if others on this group are a part of consortiums, or if consortiums could be a focus of a future conversation.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting dynamic, and I'm going to offer a parallel, and we'll see if it holds. But right, I mean, we're talking about sort of coalition building here, right, across sort of institutional spaces. And the parallel I'm thinking about is sort of the nonprofit space, right, where the funding structures are set up in a way that almost create competition across agencies and organizations, as opposed to coalition building, right? And there are movements to sort of rethink how those funding models work, so that multiple nonprofits can work together on grant writing and to get funding, as opposed to competing against each other for small pools of money. And I wonder if there's a way to sort of think about coalition building in that way in higher ed around international education, right? And what is that? How do we share those resources across institutions? And I'm not sure the larger structures are set up in a way that allow for that, right? Across types of institution, public, private, 4-year, 2-year, all of those kinds of dynamics. It's an interesting question to be thinking through. Nick, I saw you unmute. I didn't know if you had a comment around this.
I guess this is, I don't know how helpful this is, but it does make me think about, I was listening to one of the breakout groups earlier. I think it was Luis from UC Berkeley, who was speaking about how many transfer students go to UC Berkeley, which is also true. I know of, this was mentioned about UW Tacoma. It's true of UW Seattle and my department specifically. And we have managed to build some pretty successful connections, for example, with Seattle Central College. And we have, advisors who speak to each other. I think, the public-private thing could be difficult. I know that I think there are some examples where, for example, UW Seattle programs, they are open to non-UW students, not just UW Tacoma and UW Bothell, but outside of the UW system as well. The main challenge, though, is there's credit transfer, but also financial aid, right? So non-UW students can't get UW financial aid. But I sort of wonder, is there a way, if the financial aid piece, if that's able to be coordinated at through the student's home school, to then support participation in a nearby university's program? I don't know if there are any examples of that working.
Interestingly, we actually have a model like that on one of our programs at UW Tacoma. So we have a program to China that we've been running this for, goodness, over a decade. And more recently, it's been a partnership with the Tacoma Community College. And students from both institutions go together. It's run through our office, but the TCC students are enrolled through their institution, right? And so we do have they have the ability to get the benefits of their institution and the credit system while participating and sharing resources with our institution. So there are creative ways. It's oftentimes built on faculty relationships and less institutionalized. And I think that's the piece we're working on. I saw someone had their hand up and then went down. Was it Marie? Yeah, go ahead, Marie.
Yeah, it was just me, because we do have a similar type of thing with our consortium, in that students are able to enroll at the home campus for something that's offered by another school, but it's just within the community colleges. And when you consider, some of our schools, Washington State, but this could extend to all the various states represented here. It's the more rural places, let's say, Longview in Washington, or I don't know, Walla Walla Community College. They might not have that, so I wonder even if statewide or thinking larger, how can we advocate within our systems to create the flexibility to create these partnerships? Because obviously, if you can do it at Tacoma, and if we can do it through our consortium, well, why not try to do it with University of Washington and also figure out the funding and financial aid side of things? So maybe that it's big, right? But to break this stuff down, I think people have to do big things.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marie. And I see Caroline, and then I need to, we'll move into a break, but go ahead, Caroline, please. Yeah.
Hi, I guess I sort of wanted to add some comments. I definitely don't want to come across like I have answers or advice, but I currently work for USAC, University Studies Abroad Consortium, and we actually started out as faculty-led programs at University of Nevada, Reno. And it wasn't until rather recently we broke off as a formal nonprofit, but we still operate as UNR's only study abroad office. So I guess I see for us, there's a huge value in consortiums. You know, we have our close partnerships, our volunteer board of directors and all this. So maybe it's not helpful in terms of, you know, it's not like everyone can join a consortium just like within USAC, but a lot of my partners I work with are 1-person, 2-person offices. And I think in those cases, I've heard from a lot of them that they're leaning a lot either on some providers, but also like faculty-led programs, trying to get faculty buy-in, because I think short-term faculty-led programming is being seen as a really good option to move forward, to reach more students and to distribute that load. So that was just kind of, I guess, one thought I had. I certainly want to be very careful because I don't want to promote program providers for everyone. It's not going to always be the right fit, but sometimes in terms of when there is a lack of resources, I think it can be an option. And I only can feel like confident bringing that up just because of how low cost our programs are often less expensive depending on the location than a lot of American tuition and housing. But again, don't really have a perfect answer. I think community colleges can be in a really tough spot, especially with AIDS. So I'm certainly looking forward to small groups if anyone has more thoughts or definitive advice.
Thank you for that, Caroline. Thank you. So we want to honor your break and give you a chance to move and get out of the screen. And so we're going to take about 8 minutes. I apologize. We're 2 minutes short of the 10, but we'll take 8 minutes and come back at 9:40, and we'll enter into small group discussion grounded in some of these guiding inquiries, and hopefully some more of this conversation can continue in that space. So we'll see you in about 8 minutes. All right, we can go ahead and get going again. So thank you again for those who were offered some reflections on the presentations. We really appreciate it, and we'll give some thought to this idea of consortiums and coalition building, and hopefully be able to revisit it either later in this session or in the follow-up in June, as we think about that as an important piece of this process. So we want to move into our breakout session, but before we have you jump into rooms, we wanted to ask you to do some reflection. So the first part of this, and this is also available in the handout that's on the drive, and we'll also put these in the chat and then put these in the breakout rooms in a moment. But maybe take about 5 minutes. I'll get a timer going here. And if you could reflect on a study abroad program that you have either helped to develop or lead, or maybe you participated in at some point, and take a few minutes to consider the guiding inquiries we've been exploring in relation to your chosen program. So as a reminder, right, what experiences, knowledge, and understandings are being privileged and promoted? How are student participants being acknowledged, represented, and amplified? What co-design, co-creation, and co-leadership models are being employed? And so again, for the next few minutes, maybe just reflect on that, and then we'll have you break into the small groups and work through some of these discussion questions that follow. So go ahead and just on your own, reflect for a few moments, and I'll start a timer here. Okay, so Cindy's going to set up some breakouts. And in those breakouts, we would love for you to play with these 3 questions, right? So how has the program you were thinking about engaged or not engaged these guiding inquiries, right, and dynamics related to them? If you were to redesign that program or think about it differently, what would you do so that it better engaged some of these inquiries? And then if you have time, maybe take some of the thinking around that redesign and that new thinking around that program and how it might address some of the gaps in your current program offerings that you identified and talked about during the opening activity. So we'll post these questions again in a message to the breakouts, but and you'll see, you may see myself, Nick, and Du Bois popping in and out of breakouts just to listen and get a sense of what's being discussed. So we'll take about 25 minutes, I think, in these breakouts, and then we'll return and be able to debrief and speak as a larger group again. That's great. Well, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully, oh, are folks still in the rooms? Are we good? Oh, we're good. Okay. Hopefully you had a chance to work through some of the prompts we provided, but also if the conversation led in different ways, that's okay. This is really both an opportunity to explore these ideas, but also to build community. And one thing that came up in one of the small groups that I popped in on was how best to it was sort of building on that theme of building coalition and consortiums, and an interest in being able to remain in contact with each other post the workshop. And so I think what we'll do is work on creating a sort of attendee list with contact information, and we'll ask folks, we'll send an email out and saying, are you okay with being included? But obviously only share that with the group so that we can maintain these relationships and hopefully build some of those consortiums that we're talking about. That would be great. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes set aside to debrief from this conversation. I'm going to share my screen just to show you the debrief slide, and then I'll pull that down so that we can see each other more clearly. But let's see. So just as a reminder, you were discussing in your small groups to some extent, hopefully, sort of reflecting back on a program that you're familiar with, and thinking about it through the lens of these guiding inquiries or questions. And then maybe even discussing some changes you might or revisions you might think about in terms of that program and how those could be leveraged to address some gaps in your current offerings as an organization or institution. And so in a debrief, we're really interested in hearing some of the insights that emerged from the small group conversations. Also happy to track and address any questions that emerged in those conversations or that might remain for you after the presentations. And Nick and Du Bois can address some of those, or we can track them for when we reconvene in June to follow up on. So I am going to be quiet and open the floor for all of you, and I will stop my screen share.
I'm gonna break the ice because I was able to join a very, I think, meaningful discussion in a small group as well. And so one of the things that came up in our group was the challenge of navigating the fact that for faculty-led programs, we're obviously reliant on faculty stepping up to lead these programs. And there are some real limitations in how much as international educators we can actually guide the focus of those programs, right? Because we're relying on faculty to do this work. And of course, they are going to leverage their existing expertise. And I'm curious if today's presenters have any advice for how to navigate that tension, both sort of, navigating that space, especially considering that many of us working in international education are not ourselves faculty. So any advice?
I don't have any advice per se, but I will add on, because the group that I observed, many of the people, or 3 of the people in the group, had similar comments about faculty, even in regards to not just faculty-led program, but faculty advising and institution advising, and where that all falls apart. So one participant said, we do good co-creation and co-design, but then when it gets to, the students actually being advised by academic advisors or faculty, then they're just sticking with the same pipeline or these same traditional destinations. So the whole faculty component, and how I just speculate, given the comments on resources and stuff, but how can international offices be that kind of connector of these partnerships? Because faculty need to be aware, not just in terms of program design and advising, but for faculty-led programs with, faculty in country and on-site staff need to be aware of these students' backgrounds, experiences, what have you, and for the program to be truly inclusive. So how can we bring the faculty into these co-design and co-creation spaces with the communities we're trying to serve?
I think, oh, go ahead, Marissa. Yeah, I see you there.
I was just going to put in a plug, and I don't know if I really this is appropriate, but I've been following and sort of keeping up with some of the work that Tara Harvey and True North Intercultural has done recently, and I think she's got a conversation coming up. This is about our faculty's intercultural capacity, right? This is about their frame of reference and their willingness to acknowledge how they present and engage in this role, and how they connect others that they might be taking abroad, and the frame of reference they're using to do that. And so I think she's had lots of conversations with folks that her work resonates with, and she's focusing on, at this point, trying to get faculty in the room, because she knows that this issue that we're talking about, the faculty are leading the programs. And last week's session was a wonderful example of faculty and the conversation. But I think that we've maybe each of us identified, yes, there's a few in the room, but not nearly enough in the room having the conversation and doing the work to think about how they change the frame of reference in the work that they're doing, and really prioritize, the development of their programs around the people that are going to be involved in them, and the places that they're going to do this program.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think another piece of this, and I don't know that we've been super, I straddle both worlds. I am a faculty member, but I serve in this administrative role simultaneously, and so I also develop and lead programs. I think one piece here that sometimes is in our control, but not always, is how to connect this work to sort of faculty incentives, right? So when we think about promotion and tenure processes, when we think about sort of connecting this to the institutional mission or their departmental mission around equity and inclusion and preparing students for a global world, the more we're able to sort of facilitate the connection for faculty so that we help them articulate how this is of benefit for them in those spaces as well. That is I think a high effort but low resource need, right? It's not monetary incentive, but it could be institutional incentive, right? But I think it takes buy-in also from institutional leadership to then an academic leadership to really take that seriously, right? And not just think of it as an add-on to what is already being done by faculty in different ways. That same issue is arising, I think, in the worthwhile move to incorporate DEI and anti-racism work into those processes as well. Community engaged work into those processes. We can kind of try to shift our language and the ways we think about this to align with those sort of institutional priorities as well. Other things that emerged from the small group conversations. So one thing that came up in a group I was listening in on was, I'm sure this is a common dynamic for many of us, right? When faculty put a lot of effort into designing some really interesting interdisciplinary programs, what sound to all of us is really innovative and exciting opportunities, right, to draw connections, and they just don't seem to attract students, right, and students don't seem to see them through the same lens that our faculty and ourselves are seeing them. And one idea that popped up was, we oftentimes then reconvene those who created the programs to think about it, but how often are we then thinking, oh, why don't we engage students directly in that process, right? Going back to some of what Du Bois and Nick talked about. Often they're able to identify what that barrier is, right? What that area of reluctance is for students better than some of us are able to do. And so those points where like programs just don't seem to run well or aren't getting the students that we would like to get, engaging students in the process of thinking about how to solve that problem might be an opportunity here for co-design and co-creation.
Something else that was highlighted in our group was after Mr. Jennings' presentation was how important the support from the leadership, from the institution, the state, even the country is for these initiatives to be successful, and the support and also the financial aspect that helps develop the programs.
Yeah, I think I saw in the comments as Du Bois was speaking, in particular around the sort of governmental responsibility and expectations, and just imagining what that would look like in a US context, right? If the government were like, no, you will do this and you'll do it in these ways that honor and respect the Indigenous communities and marginalized communities. Oh, that would be lovely. I'm not going to hold my breath, but that would be lovely, right? You're absolutely right. It's institutional support, but also the broader sort of political and social context and structural contexts.
And I just want to add that I feel, very lucky to work with this organization in this country, but I don't want to paint a picture that, marginalized populations in Maoris face a lot of the same issues that historically marginalized populations face today. And this is something that is new. I mean, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in the 1800s, and then the Waitangi Tribunal was signed in, I think it was like the 1940s or 1960s. And it's also important to remember that this is because Maori fought very hard for this. It was not something that, the colonizers decided, oh, we should do this. No, they were fighting very hard to do this. So there's still resistance. There's still a lot of confusion. And as I said, what's striking me is you're talking about fundamentally changing the way we do programs or changing what a study abroad program could look like. So there's a lot of hesitancy around that, but it's very helpful to have our education minister outline these guidelines for us and kind of put it in our hands, say, how can you do that? And so, yeah, I was just wondering, especially coming to this idea of co-design and Jeff, what you mentioned about, working with the actual students, I just wonder if that even exists, like are students being consulted when programs are being designed, and are there communities being consulted? And this idea of community leaders and people who aren't seen as experts in the eyes of academia, who have real value to offer and insight into these communities, how are they being consulted in this program design?
Can I just add that in our group, that actually was a point of discussion as well. It was sort of this revelation of like, we had never even thought of that, of involving students in designing and co-designing a program. And it was almost like, just, can you even do that? Like it's just so revolutionary sounding. Like, can we do that? So I'm excited to bring that to the table at my institution and see where it goes. But it's again, something that had never even crossed our mind at the point of inception as involving student input into it. So it's a great idea.
If I might jump into, I work with Ramona at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And Ramona, we had talked about starting sort of a student roundtable in the Center for International Education at one point, which would be sort of the perfect medium to bring more student voice into the study abroad process, and even, some aspects of curricular design when looking at globally focused programs. A dear colleague of ours, Dina, who worked in the Institute of World Affairs, had this idea originally, and we'd been mulling it over for a while, and she unfortunately left the institution. But it's definitely something we should talk about bringing back, because I think that there would be a lot of potential there for a lot of student input in many creative ways.
Thank you both for that. Yeah, I think it does require some really, I think going back to the conversation around how to engage faculty, it does require faculty to rethink the way they understand sort of the classroom dynamic, right, in the educational system. And many of us are trained to right, I think these walls are breaking down, but many of us are trained classically to sort of be the experts, right? And so engaging students in that way and giving sort of opening the power dynamic in those spaces is really important. And I would add, and then we'll move into our closing, if we're talking about engaging students in these processes, especially students who have been historically marginalized, finding ways to compensate their work, right? And it doesn't have to be monetary compensation, although that would be lovely. But even if, right, independent studies or for-credit opportunities for them to help design these things, right? So we're not replicating forms of sort of taking advantage of students in those ways, right? And I oftentimes hear the pushback of like, well, this is part of the experience of being in school. And I'm like, well, sure. And it's also work, right? And labor, and should be valued in those ways. So. Okay, thank you, Cindy, for the reminder that we are close to time. So I'm going to share my screen again. Thank you all for these reflections and the conversations you're having. So let me share my screen for the closing. So we have two tasks for you. The first is, and you'll get an email with follow-up around all of this if you don't want to write it down now. There is a handout, another handout in the materials for this session. It's the post-session handout. And in it, you'll see the instructions for the second part of this. But for the first part, for next week, we'd love for you to bring examples of marketing materials that you have developed or seen that directly speak to a group of students that have been or currently are underrepresented in study abroad at your institution or organization. So next week's session is oriented around marketing and outreach. And so we're going to play with these materials and show some examples as well, and have some critique of those. And then for the June 24th follow-up, there is the post-session activity sheet, which is a more detailed breakdown of the guiding inquiries we played with throughout this session. Add some sub-questions within each of those. And so we're just asking that you kind of look through those and think about them in the context of your own institution and organization. And we'll revisit some of those inquiries and questions in our follow-up session on June 24th. So with that, I want to again thank Du Bois and Nick for their gracious and wonderful presentations and the work that they do and their time today. I want to thank all of you for staying on and coming back each week. This has been really exciting and interesting sessions. I'm learning a great deal. I think we're learning as much, if not more, than all of you. And so we really appreciate these opportunities to build community and make connections. And we will see you next week.